I want to welcome you to our program tonight, hosting Yale Law Professor Daniel Markovits, who will discuss his book, The Meritocracy Trap, Perspectives from the Inside, and later conversation with his Yale College 2020 summer interns. I'm Lisa Chapman, class of 81 MBA from the Yale School of Management, and honored to serve as chair of First Gen Yale, which is a Yale Alumni Association Shared Interest Group, or SIG. It was created in 2016 to connect and support alumni and students who share backgrounds being first generation, low income, underserved. We celebrate diversity of all abilities, ages, cultures, ethnicities, race, and political thought, as our alumni and students come from all Yale schools, disciplines and degrees and years. And one thing we like to do, it's been from our mission from the very beginning, is that we like to share our stories and being mentors, and we help Yale students navigate throughout Yale and beyond for academic, career, and personal success. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. We have over 220 participants who have signed up from all the Yale schools, and we include alumni from the class of 1952 all the way to recent graduates and current students. You all come from career fields ranging from education, economics, law, public service, businesses of all kind, medicine, technology. And you also come from 26 different states, the District of Columbia, Mexico, and Canada. So I want to thank you all for signing up and being with us tonight. This session will be recorded. Please mute. You all already are muted. You will be muted until we reach the question and answer period at the end. We have a double feature, which is very exciting, starting with Professor Markovits and his book, and then joining by the Yale College summer interns. So I'm very honored to welcome you tonight. And then and at the very end of our student program, I should say, Michael Watson is going to be talking with the students directly about their experience in more detail and the domestic summer award process for the students who have joined us. It's not too early to start planning your 2021 summer internships. Now it's my honor to turn it over to Barb Pertasio, class of 81, who is our host for this evening. Barb?
Thank you, Lise. Tonight's programming is sponsored by First Gen Yale DC, First Gen Yale, and the Yale Club of Washington, DC. I'm on the executive board of First Gen Yale and a co-leader with Ben Bartolome and Yvette Rivers. Please say hi, Ben. Hi, Yvette. Give us a wave.
Hi, everyone.
So please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Markovits, the Guido Calabresi Professor of Law at the Yale Law School and founding director of the Center for the Study of Private Law. Professor Markovits publishes widely and in a range of disciplines, including in science, the American Journal, the American Economic Review, and the Yale Law Journal. So his current book, The Meritocracy Trap by Penguin Press and published in 2019, develops a sustained attack on American meritocracy. So welcome, Professor Markovits. We appreciate your being here. We also have with us tonight 5 Yale undergraduates who are competitively selected for internships with First Gen Yale Summer Research Internships with Professor Markovits. Laura, we'll start with you. If you could introduce yourself briefly, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm in class of 2023, so I'm a sophomore this year. I'm in Timothy Dwight College, and I'm prospectively majoring in economics.
And Brian?
Hello, my name is Brian Mendoza. I am currently a senior at Yale University studying comparative literature, and I am a member of Davenport College.
And Jordan?
Hi, my name is Jordan Farnham. I'm at Pauli Murray College, class of 21, and I'm a political science major.
And Cam?
Hi everyone, my name is Kim and I am a junior student in Timothy Dwight College studying global affairs and also pursuing a certificate in data science.
And Haley?
Hi, my name's Haley. I'm a junior majoring in English, hoping to pursue the creative writing concentration, and I'm in Brooklyn College.
Thank you, interns, for being here with us tonight. Professor, I'm sure you'll agree you had some amazing interns working for you this summer. Welcome again. We're eager to hear directly from you on your work studying meritocracy and its effects on society.
Great. Thank you so much, Barb. Thank you, Lise. And thanks, Brian, Cam, Haley, Jordan, and Laura. You know, at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the work we did together this summer, and it was fantastic, and I learned a lot from you guys. So it was a real pleasure. I'll talk with this group. I don't want to talk too long. I'd rather have a conversation, especially with this group. But what I think I'll do is I'll spend maybe 20, 30 minutes just laying out an argument, which, as Barb said, is a direct attack on American meritocracy. That doesn't seem a very promising thing to try to mount, because meritocracy has become our society's literal common sense. Across the various bitter partisan divides that we suffer today, everyone seems to agree that people should get ahead based on their own accomplishments, rather than, say, their parents' social class or their race or their gender or their religion. In fact, you know, most of the people in this room, in this Zoom chat, got ahead in that way, and it served us individually well, and it served our society well that people get ahead in that way. The idea is that meritocracy gives everybody a fair shot at success, and it produces an elite that is capable, productive, rather than incompetent and lazy, as aristocracy might do. But the central argument of the book is that although meritocracy started off in that way, it's no longer working as it was designed, or rather, when it works just as it was designed, it produces the opposite of the effects that it aimed at. It produces a closed elite. It's become a new kind of aristocracy, only now based on degrees rather than breeding. And it produces an elite that restructures society to serve the elite rather than the public good. And so I'll spend a little time laying out some facts and some arguments that are designed to sustain that conclusion. Now, what I'm going to do that is I'm going to share my screen, because I'm going to show you some slides, and we will see whether I am technologically up to this, but I believe that I am. Now let me go to, okay, I can no longer see you, but you can presumably see my screen. Could somebody signal just to tell me that that's the case?
Yes, Daniel, we can.
Marvelous. Okay, so let's start with the high ambitions of meritocracy, and let's start with them at Yale. You know, meritocracy came to Yale when Kingman Brewster became Yale's president, saying that he did not intend to preside over a finishing school on the Long Island Sound. And instead of having Yale be populated by the children of the sons, in fact, of America's most prominent white Protestant families, he opened up Yale to a much wider set of people. Someone should know that I'm being asked to admit people from the waiting room, but is someone else able to do that also?
Yes, I am doing that.
Yes, okay, so you're on top of that, great.
Yes.
So, you know, over the course of the 1960s, Yale was totally transformed. It was transformed by Kingman Brewster. It was transformed by Inky Clark, who was the patrician named head of Yale's admissions office, although he was actually a working class kid from Long Island. And he started admitting kids based on how good they were at school. He reduced by half the number of alumni children who were admitted, massively increased the number of public school kids who were admitted, dramatically increased Yale's racial diversity. In 1969, Yale, of course, increased its gender diversity. By 1970, the median kid at Yale would have been in the top 10% of Yale's class in 1960, and the 1970 entering class got the highest grades in the history of Yale College. And the reason this worked, the reason why meritocracy opened up the elite, is, to be blunt, that the old elite, the old aristocratic elite, composed by breeding, was on the one hand not very smart, and on the other hand not very hardworking. It didn't know how to educate its kids. It had no taste for educating its kids. The most academically ambitious and competitive schools in America in 1955, 1960, 1965 were all public schools. If you attended a public school and went to Yale, you were 3 times as likely to get into Phi Beta Kappa as if you attended an elite private school like St. Paul's. And so when Yale and other institutions in America across the elite opened themselves up to ambition and talent and achievement, they brought new people in from the outside. But here's what happened. What happened is that the elite that was constructed by meritocracy was unlike the old aristocrats, in that this new elite of meritocrats had an unmatched ability to educate its children and an unlimited taste for educating its children. And today, the professionally educated elite out-educates everybody else, not just the poor, but also the middle class, to an astonishing degree. And I could go on for hours about just how dramatically distinctive the educational childhood of a very rich kid in America is today. But here are some basic facts that just give you a flavor. If you begin with schools, the typical American public high school, middle-class public high school, spends $12,000 to $15,000 per pupil per year educating its children. But a really, really rich public school district spends maybe $30,000 a year. And an elite private school, the Forbes top 20 private schools, where 80% of the kids come from households with over $200,000 a year of household income, spends $75,000 a year, so 5 times as much as a typical public school. And note that the gap between the elite private school and the public school, the rich middle class gap, which is $60,000 roughly, is 15 times bigger than the gap between the middle class school and the poor school. Now, those kinds of differences, which are replicated throughout elite childhood, produce dramatic differences in childhood achievement. This figure shows you the 90-50 and 50-10 income gaps in childhood academic achievement. So the blue line shows you the gap between the typical achievement, the average achievement of a rich kid, a kid in the top 10% of the income distribution, and a middle class kid. And the red line shows you the difference in average achievement between a middle class kid and a kid below the poverty line. And as you can see, since the middle of the last century, the middle class poor gap has remained steady or almost declined, whereas the rich middle class gap has skyrocketed. These are big amounts. The dashed blue line shows you the white-black academic achievement gap for American children over the past 70 years or so. And the red line shows you the income gap. Notice that by 2000, the rich-poor gap had become as big as the white-black gap was in 1954. 1954 was the year Brown against Board of Education was decided. So economic inequality in America today produces as big a difference in childhood academic achievement as American apartheid produced at mid-century. Once again, the biggest gaps are between the rich and the middle class, not between the middle class and the poor. On the SAT, an average kid whose parents make over $200,000 a year, that's about the top 5% of the income distribution, has an SAT score that is 250 points higher than a middle class kid. Whereas a middle class kid has an SAT score that's only 125 points higher than a kid at or below the poverty line. So the rich middle class gap on the SAT is twice as big as the middle class poor gap. And the rich poor gap is enormous. And the educated parents, uneducated parents gap is enormous. If you look at the College Board's own data, in 2018, there were roughly 5,000 kids in America, high school seniors, who took the SAT, who had at least one parent with a graduate or professional degree, whose verbal SAT score hit the Ivy League median. So 5,000 kids in America with a professional or graduate educated parents who hit the Ivy League median on the SAT. If you now ask how many kids were there, neither of whose parents had graduated high school, who hit the Ivy League median on the verbal SAT, well, the tail is so thin that statistical methods don't produce reliable results. But if you grind out the numbers, the answer is 32. So 5,000 professional school parents' kids, roughly speaking 30, call it 100, kids neither of whose parents have educated high school, hit the Ivy League median on the SAT. This obviously produces an incredibly skewed elite. And notice, it produces a skewed elite, not because rich parents bribe colleges to get their kids in, although of course they sometimes do, and not because of alumni preferences, although of course those are real and unconscionable, but by the operation of meritocratic admission standards, grades, test scores. This is the odds of getting to college in America by your parents' income rank. It's hard to imagine something more depressing than that, except this, which is the quality of the college you go to by your parents' income rank. As colleges become more competitive, their student bodies skew more and more powerfully to wealth. The 150 or so most competitive colleges in America have 14 times more students from the richest quarter of the income distribution than from the poorest quarter. In a way, that's not surprising because elite institutions have never welcomed the poor in any society. But notice that the 150 or so most competitive colleges have 6 times as many kids from the top quarter as from the second quarter and as from the third quarter. So the rich are squeezing out not just the poor, but also the broad middle class. At more elite colleges, the skew to wealth is even greater. The Ivy Plus colleges have more students from the top 1% than from the bottom half. And Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and Yale have more students from the top 1% than from the bottom 60%. Now, what we are seeing here in education is a regime in which having rich, well-educated parents is almost the necessary condition for getting well-educated and eventually rich yourself. It's a new kind of caste order. It's a way in which the meritocrats transmit their privilege dynastically down through their families' generations. And one way to think of that is to compare meritocratic inheritances with aristocratic inheritances. The way in which old-fashioned aristocrats transferred their privilege to their children is simply by dying and then leaving their children bequests, initially of land, then of factories, then of financial assets. So bequests of physical or financial capital given to the children on the death of the parents. That's how an aristocratic family endures as aristocratic across many generations. So ask yourself this, take the difference between what a typical 1% household in America today spends on educating its children and what a typical middle-class household spends, not a poor household, but a middle-class household. And in every year of the child's life, invest that difference, not in the kid's education, but instead in the S&P 500 to create a trust fund, which will be given to the child as a bequest on the death of the parents. In other words, construct a meritocratic inheritance that's the equivalent of the aristocratic inheritance and ask how big it would be. Well, the answer is it would be substantially north of $10 million per child. On the most realistic assumptions that I've put together, it actually would be more like $16 million per child. That's the extent of the inherited privilege that meritocratic education gives rich children distinctively, that not just poor children, but also middle-class children don't get. Now, why is it that elites spend so much on educating their children? Well, because it turns out that the source of wealth and income has changed in America. It used to be that poor people worked and got income from their labor. Today, the rich get most of their income from their labor. They get their income by going to places like Yale College, then going to places like Yale Law School, and then going to work for law firms like Cravath or Wachtell Lipton or Simpson Thacher. And then as partners making $5 million a year, or going to Goldman Sachs, or working as high up executives in elite companies, or working as doctors, specialist doctors. If you put together lawyers, specialist doctors, elite executives, and professionals working in finance, together with management consultants, those people make up roughly half, maybe as much as 2/3 of the richest 1% of American households. And those people owe their income to their labor. So whereas as recently as 1960, the top 1% of Americans got only about 1/3 of their income from labor, today, by my calculations, they get about 3/4 of their income from labor. The top 1/10 of 1% in 1960 got only about 1/6 of its income from labor. Today, they get about 2/3 of their income from labor. And this concentration of labor income, a shift of labor income away from middle-class workers and towards elite, or as I sometimes call them, superordinate workers, accounts for about 3/4 of the increase in the top 1%'s overall share of national income. So most of the rising high-end inequality that we see in America today is due to the explosion of elite labor incomes. And it turns out that the people who capture those enormous labor incomes are the same people as those who won the meritocratic education race, who got the fancy educations at the fancy colleges and professional schools, and before that at the fancy high schools and even elementary and preschools. In America today, only about 1 in 75 workers without a high school degree, only about 1 in 40 workers with a high school degree only, and only about 1 in 6 workers with a college degree only will have lifetime earnings equal to the median professional school graduate. Not even the Harvard Business School or Yale Law School graduate, but the median professional school graduate. So education, and in particular elite education, segments the income distribution, the labor market, in a way that dominates the explanation of these enormously high labor incomes. That's the sense in which what meritocracy has done, is it's created a new kind of aristocratic caste based on elite education and elite work that excludes middle and working class Americans from meaningful advantage. Now, the final thing I want to observe is that this caste doesn't even really benefit the meritocrats who appear to be winners. As I said earlier, it used to be in almost all of human history, if you knew how hard somebody worked, you knew how poor they would be. The hardest workers were the poorest, and the rich were a leisure class. As recently as 1979, a prime age working man in America who was in the top 5th of the hourly wage distribution was 2/3 as likely as someone in the bottom 5th to work over 50 hours a week. By 2006, the highest paid 5th of workers were twice as likely as the lowest paid 5th to work over 50 hours a week. That goes all the way up the income distribution. The richest 1% of Americans, or the highest paid 1% of Americans, work maybe 6 to 8 hours a week more today than they did in 1940, whereas the bottom 60% work maybe 8 or 9 hours a week less today than they did in 1940. That's a shift of hours worked away from the bottom 60% and towards the top 1% of roughly 16 hours a week, or 2 regulation working days. Now, it's important to understand that the reason why the bottom 60% work less is not that they don't want to work. It's that the elite has restructured the labor market and the economy in such a way that there aren't enough jobs for mid-skilled, middle class, and working class Americans. And at the same time, this restructuring of the economy has left the elite required, as a condition of maintaining their eliteness, to work enormous and immense hours themselves. The American Bar Association in 1960 said there are about 1,300 fee-paying hours in a typical lawyer's year. Today, there are law firms that have billable minimums of 2,500 hours, and I know lawyers who bill 4,000 hours. Top executives work 60, 70, 80, 90 hours a week. Investment bankers work 80, 90, 100 hours a week. It's a condition of being in the elite that you work all the time, and that you work at whatever task pays you the most. And if you don't, you won't have the income needed to buy the private school for your kids, which will get them the same elite life path that you have. At the same time, there's surprising social precarity in the elite. These slides, this slide, which is the last I'll show, shows economic inequality in 3 different parts of the American economy and society. The black line measures inequality over time in the full society. As you can see, it's been rising pretty steadily since the mid-1970s. The red line shows inequality in the bottom 70%. So imagine taking the richest third of Americans and throwing them away and looking only at the bottom 2/3 or so. And as you can see, inequality within the bottom 2/3 today remains lower than it was in 1965. The blue line shows inequality inside the richest 5%, inside the top 20th of the distribution. And the top 20th now has more inequality inside of it than the whole distribution. So there is more economic inequality in America today in the richest 5% of households than in America overall. And this produces the feeling in the elite that although they're incredibly wealthy, they are constantly looking up at people who are even wealthier than they are, and they're constantly worried that they or their children will be excluded from caste and privilege, will lose their status. So what meritocracy has done is it's created a system, it's a kind of a gilded cage that ensnares the rich and excludes the rest, and leaves nobody in our society particularly well off or flourishing. And the story of the book is the story of how this has happened And the argument of the book is an argument about what's wrong with this system and what we might do to make things better. I think I will stop there, and we should have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Markovits. Very interesting. We have some questions that have come in the chat, and we also have some questions that people sent in earlier. The first one is actually from Catherine. Is this data based on American students only, or does it include international students?
So the data on college enrollment, you mean?
Yes. All of the data in this presentation so far.
So the data in this presentation includes, on the workers' side, all workers, regardless of citizenship. On the student side, it mostly includes all students. It mostly includes all students. But you're right to ask the question, how should international students be ranked in the American distribution? Which is a fair question to ask. I don't think it actually makes much of a difference to the outcome, because the number of international students at elite universities in America, particularly for undergraduates, although it has gone up some, remains relatively low compared to domestic students. That would not be true in graduate schools, but these are undergraduate data. And it's also, interestingly, mostly still true in professional schools, law and business. Well, law in particular remains highly domestic. Business, particularly in the MBA, is relatively more domestic than, say, physics or mathematics or economics.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Hunter. Thank you, Hunter. Do you have a view on whether the phenomenon you are describing is specific to the US, or is it common among other advanced economies as well?
I think that's a really interesting question. You know, the data I have is for the US. The Anglo-Saxon world looks more like the US. So the country that is most like the US is the UK, actually. It's characterized by two things that are distinctive in the US also. On the one hand, enormous high-end income inequality driven by elite labor. And on the other hand, a spiky fine hierarchy in private educational institutions. Countries like Germany and France, or the Nordic countries, have neither of those things. They tend to have less unequal labor income, and they tend to have a dominantly public educational system. Now, it is true, though, that the US style of inequality is starting to come to those countries. Germany is acquiring private high schools and private universities. It's acquiring high-end elite labor jobs that are very restrictive in whom they will hire. France is looking like this also. And so one thing that's happened is that the US model is beginning to infect some of the societies that have resisted it so far. Whether it will take over those societies or not, I think no fair-minded person can confidently say. I should say also, there are some other countries that look like this. Korea looks a lot like the US, it turns out. Korea looks very much like the US. China, in some respects, looks like the US. Japan, not at all. Japan, not at all. Latin America, not at all. So it's complicated how this story generalizes elsewhere. I guess the last part of an answer to this question is that the mechanisms and forces that are described in the book are in principle universal. They will apply everywhere, and sometimes they will be met by counter mechanisms and counter forces, which will override them or hold them at bay, and sometimes not. But they'll never be totally absent.
Oh, thank you. So Robin has a question. Do you think that changes in tax policies over the past 50 years have had an impact on increasing inequality of wealth in America?
Sure. So there's no question that changes in tax policies have made inequality worse. Just many people on this call probably know this, but you know, if you just take a guess in your head, if you don't know this, what was the top marginal tax rate in the United States during the Eisenhower administration? So the answer turns out to be 92%. 92%. Obviously today the top marginal tax rate is much, much lower. And high taxes have two effects. First, they fund public services. And second, they create a disincentive for private elite workers to fight very hard for enormously high wages. because it'll get taxed away anyway. So there's no question that taxes have played a role. But I don't think taxes have played the original causal role. I think rather the causation goes in the other direction. So here's a very, very striking thing about the United States in the past years. Actually, give me one moment and I will show you a slide I had not intended to show you, but it's sufficiently striking that it's completely worth my showing to you. Hold on. It will show you the trajectory of tax rates and incomes by brackets over time in the United States. And you will see something sort of astonishing. Okay, here we are. View full screen. Do you see it again now or not?
Not yet.
Okay, I need to share my screen first.
Yeah, you guys.
Okay, now you will see it.
Yes, now we see it.
Okay, I'm not going to use the full screen, but what this shows you is cumulative real household income growth in the United States. And the warmer colors are more elite income. So as you can see, the top 1% has had a lot more income growth than, say, the bottom 20%. Okay. Now, this slide shows you average tax rates by income group over the same period. And as you can see, the same groups that have had the greatest income growth have also had the biggest decline in their tax rates. So if you look at the colors, it's astonishing the way in which the color coding correlates effectively perfectly. The more your market income went up, the more your taxes went down over this period. Now, that's kind of an astonishing thing because you would think, in fact, since Aristotle, political scientists have thought that what do democracies do? Well, when the rich get really rich in democracies, the democratic mass taxes away their wealth. But in the United States, what seems to have happened is that as the elite gets richer and narrower and smaller, the democratic process has relieved it of taxes and taxed everybody else, in particular the upper middle class. Why is that? Well, I think there are two reasons. One reason is ideological, which is that meritocracy purports to render enormous inequality morally okay. In fact, morally admirable. The rich work hard, they're productive, they're super skilled, they deserve their income. And so it saps the political will to tax top labor incomes. It's much more politically palatable to say, if you inherit a lot of money and you're a good for nothing and a wastrel, we should tax you. Than it is to say, if you have been working really hard since you were 3 years old and outperformed everybody else and have this enormous set of skills that are really valuable because everybody else will pay you to work your skills, we're going to tax you. That's hard to do. So that's one reason why. And the second reason why is that what meritocracy has done is it's created a class of elite lawyers and accountants who have super skills, which they deploy in what might be called the income and wealth defense industry to resist efforts to tax them. And so what you have under modern meritocracy, actually for the first time since the Middle Ages, is that the government and private wealth are competing for the same fundamental resource. In the Middle Ages, they were competing for the fighting power of knights. Today, they're competing for the analytic and manipulative power of professional elites. And when that happens, the private sector wins and the state becomes unable to assert its will against it. So on my view, in answer to the question, yes, taxes are a big part of the problem, but they're not the originating cause. The originating cause is the particular kind of meritocratic inequality that I've described.
Thank you. So Chuck has a question and actually a comment. He's saying thought-provoking and disturbing, and he promises he will buy the book like everyone should. But he asked if you could please say something about what you see as the solution or some solutions to these issues.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So first of all, let me just be honest. I'm better on diagnosis than cure. Most people are. I think we're living through a transformation that is as profound as the Industrial Revolution. If at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, a well-meaning English king and prime minister had been told that by 1860, industrialization would have been so grindingly brutal to the English population that the life expectancy of a child born in Manchester would be lower than at any time since the Black Death, since bubonic plague, which is what actually happened. So between 1800 and 1860, industrialization so damaged the English working class that it was as harmful to children born in 1860 as the plague had been in the Middle Ages. I don't think the prime minister could have done anything about it. Industrialization was going to do what industrialization did. So I think we're in a similar position. It's not easy to know what to do about this. But if you want to be more optimistic, we have more power then, we have a greater capacity to influence events. And I would recommend two kinds of solutions. The first is to intervene in the educational system. What we have right now, as I just described to you in the talk, is this enormous concentration of educational resources in an incredibly narrow elite of rich kids. And because educational institutions are organized as not-for-profits, that's true of Yale, it's also true of Exeter and Andover, it's true of St. Paul's, it's true of the elite preschools in New York City. Those expenditures come out of non-taxed dollars. Elite endowments grow without being taxed, and alumni donations are tax deductible to the alumni. Somebody recently calculated that Princeton University's tax exemption amounts to a public subsidy of $100,000 per Princeton student per year. Compare that to $12,500 of public money per student per year at the State University of New Jersey at Rutgers, and $2,500 per student per year at Essex County Community College, which is a local community college up the road from Princeton. So the kids at Princeton get 40 times the public subsidy that the kids at Essex County Community College get. But the kids at Princeton are overwhelmingly from the top 1% of the income distribution, whereas the kids at Essex County Community College are overwhelmingly working and middle-class kids. That cannot be right. And so the first thing that we should do is dramatically restructure education in America to force elite educational institutions, not just Yale, Harvard, and Princeton, but private schools, rich suburban school districts, private elementary schools, to admit many more students and many more working and middle-class students. The US is one of only 3 OECD countries whose public system spends more on educating rich kids than on educating poor kids. Again, that's nuts. So the first thing we should have is a massive investment in education, coupled with a requirement that these institutions educate economically diverse student bodies. And the way in which I would do this, I would say, if they don't, they lose their tax exemption. Because if they don't, they're effectively rich person's clubs. And why should rich person's clubs get taxed as charities? The second thing is a systematic intervention in the labor market. There are lots of parts to that intervention. I don't want to talk too long or bore you, but there are tax components, and then there are also regulatory and subsidy components. So right now, because the Social Security wage tax has its tax base capped at roughly $130,000, after that, high earning workers don't pay Social Security wage taxes. What this means is that in effect, middle-class labor is on the margin the highest tax factor of production in the American economy. That's inefficient and unjust. So I would get rid of the cap on the Social Security wage tax. I would take the money that comes from that, which the CBO estimates at 1 to 2% of GDP, and I would use that to fund the educational reforms. That's one thing I'd do. Another thing I would do is I would invest in wage subsidies for middle-class jobs. I would also invest in regulatory reforms that, for example, give unions seats on corporate boards, which would encourage corporations to restructure their managerial hierarchies to devolve both authority and wages to middle-class workers, to disempower elite executives. So we could talk about all those things. Now, John Carberry, I think you are shaking your head. So I don't know if you're shaking your head because you disagree, but if so, I would love to hear why you disagree. I don't know if it's allowed in this setting, but that seems like it's a fair-minded to give time to the other side.
Would you like me to unmute him?
I don't know, John, do you want to be unmuted?
Okay, ready, John? Here you go. John, you have to unmute. You have to click the mute button so the red line's not through. There you go. John, you're on.
No, I read
Can
the
you,
book.
John, can you introduce yourself? Tell about your
Yes,
Yale year.
I'm a class of 1965. I was first gen scholarship student. I worked bursary jobs at Yale as well as some others. Came from I guess a semi-decent high school in Northwest New Jersey, public school. And I find the idea of the meritocracy to be extremely important. I think I live in Boston area, and I find that the people I interact with who are the wealthiest are not the Ivy League grads, multi-generational from that area, but the people, the risk takers, the real estate developers, the guys who and women who started companies of various types and have worked to be successful. At my age, I am still working, not because I need to, but because I find it challenging. I can. I'm a deal junkie. And I find that the people I interact with are not the ones described in the book. They are, in many cases, people who had come from still areas and economic situations that are not multi-generational Ivy League parents, grandparents, et cetera. And I think that's something that was missed in the calculations that were done in the book. There's a lot going on out here that has nothing to do with the Ivy League, has nothing to do with anybody who is a multi-generational person of that type, but someone who has guts, willingness, and a great salesmanship to make things happen. And the fact that many of us are working multiple hours is not a burden. We enjoy it. It's what we do. It's what we find challenging and making our lives still very worthwhile. And I think that was totally missed in the calculations and the description in the book.
Great. So let me give 3 responses to that. And I'll just preface this by saying, partly I suspect we have an empirical disagreement, a disagreement about the facts. And there's no way that we can resolve that disagreement authoritatively on a Zoom call, because we'd have to actually get into the data and look at, I'd show you the data I have, you'd show me the data you have. But nevertheless, let me try to say something that's productive along these lines. Two empirical observations. The first is that what you're describing is to be much more true of people in your generation than it is of people in my generation. And more true even of people in my generation than it is of people in the generation 20 years younger. Because your generation still came up through the time when meritocracy was an opening force rather than a closing force. And so it's true that in the elite, the more senior you are, the more likely you are to have working and middle-class background. Whereas the 30 to 50-year-olds are much less likely. I see that just anecdotally. If I look at the Yale Law School faculty, all of the people over 70, almost to a person, had parents who were working class. Everybody in my generation had professional parents. It's uncanny. It's uncanny. And that's because in my generation, we are the kids of that generation, you see. Right? So that's the first point. The second point is that you're absolutely right that the book does not focus on the entrepreneurs, the risk takers. Those people are real. It is in fact the case if you look at the ranks even of the very richest people. If you look at, the book talks about those a little bit, the Forbes rich lists and things in America. The share of those that are self-made rather than education-based has gone way down over the past 50 years, but there are still real entrepreneurial opportunities. And the book doesn't talk about those. I will report, and this is the part where we can't get to resolution of this on a call, that most of the top incomes are not like that. There are some prominent top incomes that are like that. But if you, as I said, if you just look at people working at Goldman Sachs or people working in elite finance, people who are vice presidents or above at S&P 500 or S&P 1500 companies, lawyers at law firms whose profits per partner exceed $400,000 a year, specialist medical doctors, accountants at the big accounting firms, and management consultants at the big management consulting firms, just that set of jobs is over half of the 1%. And those people are not the risk takers. Those people are the degree having meritocrats. So that's an empirical claim, which is not to deny that the types of people you describe exist. Final point on the loving of work. That's, I think, the hardest and sort of most complicated and most emotionally demanding and intellectually demanding part of this observation to respond to. Some of us love our work. I love my work. I do think I do more of it than is emotionally healthy for me. And I do it somewhat compulsively because I'm in a culture in which I'm constantly evaluated for how productive I am. But I'm not unhappy in my work at all. On the other hand, I'm in a very unusual place as an academic who doesn't have a boss. Sounds like you're a deal maker, so you're in an unusual place. If you look at the data that social psychologists have collected about elite high school students, elite college students, elite professional school students, the people who work at elite law firms, big companies in finance, the data shows that they report low life satisfaction and enormous psychological and emotional strain. And one of the things that the book is trying to do is give an economic and sociological diagnosis of why people who seem to have everything might nevertheless report a set of complaints that you wouldn't expect them to have. And there, this is a speculative diagnosis based on data rather than a report of fact. And I could be getting it wrong.
Thank you. Barb, do we have time for more questions? We have about 20 more questions in the chat. You need to unmute yourself.
Daniel, did you want to speak about the work that your interns have been doing over the summer?
Sure, I'm happy to say something about that, and then you all should chip in. So one thing that the pandemic has done, I think, is unmask this kind of inequality and lay it bare for people who were previously unwilling to see it, to be unable to ignore. And it's done that both in the labor market and in schooling. So think about the people that we now call essential workers: garbage collectors, care workers, warehouse workers, grocery workers, teachers. These were not, and still are not, the highest paid, highest status jobs in our economy and society. And at the same time, they're jobs that have a very interesting property. There was a study done by English economists that asked this question: for every dollar, or in that case, every pound of wages that a carer, a rubbish collector, or a teacher captures for themselves, how much social product is produced? And the economists concluded about 10 pounds. So those jobs, these jobs that we now call essential workers, capture only about 1/10 of their social product as private wages. If you look at bankers and lawyers, for every dollar of wages that they capture, what's the social product? The study suggested maybe less than $1. So those are jobs that capture more than 100% of their social product as private wages. Now, notice, those are the jobs that are the meritocrat jobs in our labor market. They're the jobs, Goldman Sachs, Cravath, are sweeping up Yale and Yale Law School graduates, whereas the New Haven Department of Sanitation is not. Okay, so one thing the pandemic is showing is that lots of the people who are most highly paid are actually not the people who are essential to the rest of our flourishing. On the other hand, something the pandemic is showing is that there's this massive divide in education. Almost all of the biggest public school districts in America are not teaching in person right now. And not only that, they're having an incredibly hard time teaching remotely. Partly their students have problems with computers and broadband access. That's actually the easiest part of the problem to solve. even if you give these students laptops and broadband accounts, they're still living in small houses with many siblings, with parents who are under strain. They don't have calm, quiet, private places to do their schoolwork. It's incredibly hard to teach under those circumstances remotely. One thing school is, public school, is a safe, well-ordered place for kids to learn. And that's been taken away. On the other hand, elite private schools are often in person. Some of them have bought private designated testing machines and just test their students all the time. And when they're remote, they have students whose parents are still employed, who live in big houses, whose parents have academic skills and can help them learn, and they can teach very effectively remotely. So one thing we're seeing now with the pandemic is that education, full stop, has become almost a private good that rich people buy, that the public system is very, very challenged to deliver. And so one thing the students and I did is we spent some time talking about how to think about this. And then you all, I'm looking at those of you who are on my screen, Jordan, Brian, Haley, Laura, Cam, you went out and did a series of structured interviews with more privileged students and other people you got to know through Yale, and less privileged students that you knew from your home communities, to talk about what the challenges of education and work in the pandemic are, how it's affected life and ambition. And we've got almost all of them now, and we're working our way through them, and we're going to read them and discuss them together and decide what kind of a scholarly product we should make out of them. So that's what we did this summer. It would have been literally impossible to do without you guys. And one of the ironies of meritocracy is that you guys are incredibly good at what you do because you're meritocrats. And I'm railing against the system, but it's also the case that were it not for your skills, we couldn't have done this.
So I'd like to start with Laura. I have a question for Laura. So overall, what was your experience like working with Professor Markovits during your 2020 DSA award?
Oh, everybody calls me Daniel. So you guys should call it, the students should call me Daniel too.
I think the most incredible part about working with Professor Markovits, or Daniel, was that he was so engaged in the conversations with us, and he would pose like situations to us or sort of like concepts that we would all think about for a few minutes and then share our thoughts. And it was very interesting because they were ideas that I had never previously thought of, especially in such an intimate setting with a professor, because at the time, like I had just finished my first year and now I'm in my second year. So that was a really, really valuable experience, and I really enjoyed that.
And next I'll ask Haley, can you describe your project and some of the outcomes that you experienced personally when you went and did your interviews?
Yeah, so we had a couple different kind of projects that we focused on. I think initially one of the first assignments we did was more of a reflection, personal essay, just so everyone in the group could kind of acclimate to each other's personal experiences, which I think was really pivotal for like kind of getting more cohesion in the group and just making it more comfortable for everybody. And then we kind of set up, we did some initial research, compiled annotated bibliographies on sources we were interested in. And then we eventually set out to do a series of interviews with a variety of people, educators, parents, fellow students from different backgrounds, both from our home communities and from Yale. And I think one of the most interesting findings from all that work was getting like a new sense of language to understand aspects of the Figley experience that I think can be isolating or can feel really singular. And just getting an understanding that those are perhaps more universal and more felt among different Figley students than we even realize. And just understanding how the school figures very differently depending on the community, and that people conceive very differently of the role of the school. from primary education all the way up to college education, depending on the communities they come from.
All right, thank you. And Brian, how did you feel about the work you were doing and how it might have been different from what you thought it was going to be at the beginning and how it turned out towards the end of your internship?
Yeah. At the beginning, I wasn't really sure what to expect because the program, for me at least, was something I decided to do last minute, but in the end, turned out to be this great opportunity to help me look into like aspects of my own experience going to Yale and participating in this sort of meritocracy trap, so to speak. We were able to, Haley mentioned, we put together annotated bibliographies and we're able to discuss the different perspectives of the issues at hand with each other and with Daniel. And oftentimes that led us to talk about things like the generational gap, the generational gap in experience and economic growth, as well as how culture plays and cultural appropriation changes that sort of conversation, especially for a lot of these communities that are defined by their cultural groups. It became so much more than what we started with, and I'm really glad that happened.
Well, Jordan, do you have a few things you would like to say before we move on to our internship workshop, in a sense, to help other students and other sponsors who are interested in doing internships with Yale College students next summer? If you'd like to share what your ideas were that you learned from this summer.
Sure. So I think I came into the project somewhat doubting the sort of, I guess, general thesis that kind of Daniel was putting out there. I think I sort of recognized I grew up kind of in this sort of low income family, was on free lunch during high school and still kind of managed to consistently do well. And I think it then became a question of figuring out how my experience could be universalized or distinguished from other people's. I think that's a similar question that some people proposed kind of in the chat here. And I think upon sort of doing these sort of primary interviews with a lot of school districts, it became increasingly prevalent what resources schools provide to communities that oftentimes richer schools or private districts don't have to provide. So when we contacted various school boards to see what their responses were, when you talk to these wealthy private schools in New York or DC, they aren't giving lunches to students. They aren't having these same technology drives that a lot of these sort of more public school districts are doing, and sort of facilitates the discussion that a lot of these private districts and these larger school districts need to be giving out school lunches even when their buildings are closed, because otherwise these families can't access them. When we talked to people, we had this discussion about how families and parents can't stay home with their kids to watch them as they're doing their Zoom classes if they have to work. And so I think it revealed that even if people are able to succeed within the system, the extra sort of subsidies that are needed and given to a lot of these people emphasize the discrepancies that are experienced by these different income classes.
Thank you, Jordan. And Cam, you have the last word here for our interns. What would you recommend doing such an internship to future students who are looking at summer internships that would be supported by funds from the summer award at Yale?
Yes, absolutely. So for me, my background is a little bit different than other Yale students. So before transferring to Yale last year, I attended a community college in Boston where I earned an associate degree in mathematics. So when I first during my first semester, when I first transitioned from community college to Yale, it was definitely like challenging because, as Professor have mentioned, there was like a huge difference in terms of academic challenge and also cultural barriers, different things that I wasn't aware while I was in community college. So being part of Professor research this summer and able to contribute my unique experience was very insightful for me, and also helped me to reflect on my lived experience and kind of have like a safe space where I can voice my perspective of opinion on these very disturbing issues. So I would totally recommend other fellow students to participate in these meaningful research.
Well, thank you, Cam. And Professor, the final 30 seconds are yours.
Just thank you all very, very much. I'm going to be in touch with the students over the course of the term in the spring, of course. But Lisa and Barb, thanks again for everything. Thanks to all of you for coming. I wish I could stay for the second hour, but I have school-age children and have now to go give them supper. So that's my next task for the evening. But I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to work with the Yale students and to speak to you all. And I hope we have further engagements in one way or another over the coming years. Thanks very much.
Wait, before you sign off, I want to give Daniel a round of applause, and you can do your little happy little hands and all that. I also want to just thank you, Daniel, because Daniel is a trailblazer, and I'll give you a second or two of the background story. Barb, Michael, and I got together as part of the executive committee for First Gen Yale about seeing if we could get some help for us over the summer, because we're very busy creating programs and events for First Gen alumni and students. And so we looked into the DSA program, assuming we could actually apply. We're not yet a 501c3, so we're not eligible. But Barb knew Daniel, because Barb was going to host Barb, Yvette, and Ben were going to host Daniel in Washington, D.C., but COVID-19 hit, so plans got pushed aside. So Barb reached out to Daniel, and working collectively, the three of us with Daniel, and actually the Office of Career Strategy with the DSA program, work through recruiting, finding, interviewing a number of Yale College students who were eligible. They have to be on financial aid, who are eligible to apply for a DSA grant, which for those people who don't know, is $4,000 for 240 hours in the summer, mostly July and August. And in a 3-day period, we went from a job description to Daniel selecting 6 out of 6 students who we interviewed on a Thursday night. So I want to thank Daniel and these students who are also trailblazers, because you guys, being Yale College, you have your eyes and ears with Daniel, with Yale Law School. You got to see how the legal mind works, what research is all about. And we at First Gen Yale cannot thank you enough, Daniel and Haley, Jordan, Brian, Cam, Laura, and am I missing someone? Who am I missing?
Well, we had Allie as well, but she couldn't be here with us tonight.
And Allie, who could not join us today, unfortunately. You guys have made a mark, and you've changed Yale, and you've changed it for the better. And we hope to replicate this program through other parts of Yale and more of the professional schools. So if there are any alums on here who run a nonprofit or public service, and you'd like to hire a Yale student, actually Yale, the DSA award, Domestic Summer Award, pays for it. Be in touch with us, email us, and we'll help you do it. Michael will go into more detail, but I just want to give a round of applause again for Daniel and the 5 students who are on this, because you made this program incredibly rich. Thank you. And go out and buy Daniel's book. We're all going to read his book, and want to thank you again.
Thank you all.
On behalf of Washington, D.C. chapter of First Gen Yale, thank you, Professor, Haley, Cam, Jordan, Brian, and Laura. We really appreciate your time tonight. So we have about—
we cross paths in person when this is over.
Oh,
take care.
Definitely. Thank you.